July 4, 1961. While America celebrated its independence with fireworks and flags, deep beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, something far more terrifying was unfolding. Not on live television, not in newspapers, not in the eyes of the watching world. Inside a sealed steel hull, a group of men stood frozen in front of a door. And every single one of them knew the moment that door opened, their bodies would begin to die. Some of them would spend their final days begging for the pain to stop, begging not for medicine, but for death itself. This is the story of the K-19. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Soviet sailors didn't call her by her name. They called her something else, something darker. Stay with me, because what happened next has never fully left the history books, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. Part 1. The race no one could afford to lose. To understand K-19, you have to understand the world that built her. The Cold War wasn't a war of bullets. It was a war of fear. For nearly 50 years, two superpowers stared at each other across an ocean, each one holding enough firepower to end civilization. Children practiced hiding under school desks as if wood and plastic could stop a nuclear blast. Families dug shelters into their backyards. And deep in secret shipyards, engineers raced against the clock to build machines no one hoped to ever use, but everyone was terrified the other side would use first. In 1959, the United States unveiled something the world had never seen: the USS George Washington, the first submarine on Earth capable of launching nuclear missiles from underwater. Invisible, untraceable, unstoppable. For the Soviet Union, this wasn't just a technological leap, it was a direct threat to their survival and their pride. So Moscow gave an order. Build one. Build it now. Build it faster than anyone thought possible. That order became K-19. Part 2. A ship born under a bad sign. Here's what almost no one outside the Soviet Navy knew at the time. K-19 wasn't just fast-tracked, she was rushed. Dangerously, recklessly rushed. Engineers flagged serious concerns about the reactor's cooling system. They said it wasn't reliable enough for a vessel like this. Those warnings were buried, because in a Cold War, deadlines mattered more than safety reports. The submarine had to launch, period. And so K-19 slid into the water, carrying a secret inside her hull, a hidden flaw that no one could see, but everyone would eventually feel. Now, if you believe in omens, what happened next might send a chill down your spine. During the traditional christening ceremony, tradition demanded a woman smash a champagne bottle against the hull. Instead, a man did it, and the bottle didn't even break. It bounced off the steel and clattered onto the deck. To sailors, men who live and die by superstition, this wasn't a clumsy accident. This was a warning from the sea itself, and the warnings kept coming. Fires, leaks, reactor malfunctions, injuries, even deaths, before K-19 had completed a single major mission. Word spread quickly through the fleet. There was a ship out there that seemed to hunger for tragedy. The crew gave her a nickname, Cursed. They had no idea just how right they were. Part 3. The calm before the storm. In June of 1961, K-19 launched into her first major training exercise, codenamed Operation Polar Circle. She sailed deep into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, far from any rescue, far from any help, completely alone with whatever might go wrong. For weeks, everything seemed fine. The crew settled into routine. Watch shifts, meals, sleep, repeat. By July 4th, they were finally heading home. The sea was calm. Most of the men off duty were resting in their bunks, dreaming of dry land and warm food. There was no reason to believe anything was wrong. And that false sense of safety is exactly what makes what happened next so chilling. At 4:15 in the morning, while most of the crew slept, an alarm tore through the submarine. Part 4. The 20 minutes that changed everything. A pressure tube inside the starboard reactor had ruptured. It sounds small when you say it out loud. A tube, a crack. But inside a nuclear reactor, small doesn't exist. The cooling system that was supposed to keep the reactor stable began failing in real time. Temperatures climbed, fast, faster than anyone expected. And here's the detail that should terrify you the most. K-19 had no backup emergency cooling system. None. If the reactor kept heating unchecked, there was only one outcome: a meltdown, or something even worse, a nuclear explosion, deep in the middle of the Atlantic. But the danger wasn't only physical, it was political, and this is where the story becomes almost unbelievable. Remember the date, July 4th, American Independence Day. If that reactor detonated, thousands of miles from Moscow, American radar and satellites might detect the blast and assume it was an attack. A single mechanical failure, deep underwater, could have been misread as the opening shot of World War III. Captain Nikolai Zateyev understood the stakes instantly. He gave the order to surface, and then he gathered his officers for a conversation no commander should ever have to have. Part 5. Walking into the room with no return. Someone had to enter the reactor compartment. There was no debate about that. It simply had to happen. The problem was almost too horrifying to say out loud. That compartment was already flooding with lethal radiation. Whoever walked through that door wasn't just risking injury. They were walking directly into a death sentence, and everyone in that room knew it. There was no proper radiation suit on board, no specialized shielding, no safe protocol for what they were about to attempt. Just gas masks, thin raincoats, and the terrifying knowledge that every second inside that chamber was stealing years, maybe decades, off their lives. Later measurements would suggest radiation levels inside that space reached somewhere between 50 and 60 sieverts per hour. To put that in perspective, a dose of just a few sieverts is often fatal. These men weren't just risking illness. They were walking into what could only be described as a death chamber, and someone had to volunteer first. Part 6. The first man through the door. That man was Lieutenant Boris Korchalov, 23 years old. Before he stepped forward, Captain Zateyev looked him directly in the eyes and asked if he truly understood what he was about to face. Korchalov said yes. The captain's response has been recorded in history, and it's haunting even today. It is hard to send people to their death. Go with God. Korchalov walked through that door. Minutes later, he stumbled back out, vomiting, his mask torn off, his face and hands already burned a deep, angry red. He collapsed almost immediately. And here is the part that should stop you cold. The work didn't stop. It couldn't. Part 7. Into the fire. Again and again. Teams of 2 began entering the reactor compartment in short bursts, 5, maybe 10 minutes at a time, welding broken pipes, dragging cables through smoke and heat, fighting fires sparked by overheating wires, all while radiation silently tore through their bodies. One by one, they went in. One by one, they came back out sick, shaking, unable to stand. Skin turned red, then blistered, then began to peel away in sheets. Some vomited the second they reached open air. Others couldn't speak at all, their throats too damaged, their bodies too shocked. And yet, somehow, through failed attempts and unbearable pain, they kept building. Eventually, against every possible odd, they succeeded. A crude, makeshift cooling system was rigged using scavenged parts and raw determination. Cold water was forced into the reactor. Temperatures began, slowly, to fall. A meltdown had been prevented. K-19 was saved. But the men who saved her had already signed away their futures without knowing it. Part 8. The poison you cannot see. Radiation doesn't stay where you put it. It spread through the submarine's ventilation system, silently filling the air the entire crew was breathing. There was no escaping it now. Nearly everyone on board had been exposed to some degree, but the volunteers who entered that reactor room had absorbed doses that were, in many cases, already fatal. And then came the part of this story that is genuinely difficult to read. This was acute radiation syndrome, and it doesn't kill quickly. It kills in stages. First, nausea, vomiting, fever, dizziness. Then, cruelly, a brief window where some of the men seemed to improve, where hope crept back in. And then, the body began to fail for real. Hair fell out in clumps. Skin peeled away in layers. Internal bleeding began as blood vessels broke down from the inside. Organs began shutting down, one after another. Survivors later said some of the men could only whisper a single word near the end. Please. They weren't asking for medicine. There wasn't any that could help them. They were asking for the suffering to finally end. Part 9. Rescue and the truth left behind. Nearby Soviet vessels rushed to help, arriving between July 4th and July 5th. The most severely contaminated men were stripped on deck, their radioactive clothing thrown into the ocean. Survivors were rushed to medical facilities for emergency treatment, but for many, the damage had already been sealed inside them. Some died within days. Others lived weeks, months, even years, before cancers and organ failures finally caught up with them. Out of 139 men aboard K-19 that day, 22 would eventually die as a direct result of radiation exposure. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. The Soviet government didn't want the world to know. Medical records were quietly altered. The true cause of the men's illnesses was hidden, even from their own families. Survivors were ordered into silence, forbidden from ever telling their story. For decades, they carried this trauma completely alone, unable to speak, unable to be honored, unable to even grieve properly in public. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union that the full truth finally came to light. By then, K-19 had already earned a nickname among sailors that says everything you need to know. They called her Hiroshima. Part 10. A curse that refused to end. You'd think, after a disaster like this, the story would end there. It didn't. K-19 returned to active service after repairs, and the curse, if you want to call it that, followed her. In 1969, she collided violently with an American submarine beneath the waves. In 1972, a fire on board killed 30 more sailors. In 1982, yet another accident claimed the life of one more crew member. Finally, in 1990, K-19 was permanently decommissioned, retired from a service record soaked in tragedy from the very beginning. Closing. Today, K-19 isn't remembered just as a disaster. She's remembered as a story about the men who walked into a radioactive room, knowing, truly knowing, that they might never walk back out. And because they did, a possible nuclear catastrophe was prevented. A tragedy, as horrific as it was contained instead of spreading further. A mistake that could have ended the world didn't. But make no mistake, that outcome was never free. It was paid for, in full, in human lives. If this story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, make sure you're subscribed because history has far more stories like this one waiting to be told. And you don't want to miss the next one.